The story of the Second World War is, in our collective imagination, a story of immense and brutal force. It is a history written in the language of steel, of screaming artillery, of the grinding treads of 10,000 tanks, and the overwhelming, industrial-scale application of destructive power. We think of victory as being measured in tonnage, in factory output, in the sheer number of men and machines that could be thrown into the great meat grinder of the front line. But beneath this grand, noisy narrative of conventional warfare, another, stranger kind of war was being fought. It was a war of whispers, of illusions, of theatrics, and of carefully crafted lies. It was a war fought not with brute force, but with the subtle and powerful art of deception. Imagine a new kind of army, a unit whose mission was not to fight, but to perform. An army whose soldiers were not farm boys and factory workers, but were instead recruited from the art schools, the advertising agencies, and the recording studios of New York and Philadelphia. Their weapons were not rifles, but paintbrushes. Their ammunition was not bullets, but sound waves, broadcast from massive speakers, mounted on armored trucks. Their battlefield was not the physical landscape of France or Germany, but the far more delicate and vulnerable landscape of the human mind, specifically the mind of the German High Command. Their singular purpose was to create a phantom, a ghost army that did not exist, and to make the enemy believe in it with all their heart. This was the strange, top-secret world of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit of just 1,100 men whose audacious task was to impersonate entire divisions of 30,000. They were masters of a new kind of warfare, a multimedia deception that attacked the enemy's senses. They wielded an arsenal of inflatable rubber tanks that, from a distance, were indistinguishable from the real thing. They conducted a symphony of destruction, using powerful sound systems to mimic the noise of advancing armored columns, and they practiced a form of battlefield theater, with actors dressed as generals driving into French towns, deliberately spreading false information for local spies to overhear. This was a high-stakes performance, a piece of grand, mobile theater where a single, critical mistake, a single missed cue, could result in the annihilation of their own small, vulnerable unit and the real units they were trying to protect. Tonight, we are going on a deep, methodical dive into this incredible story. We will not be focusing on the dramatic heroics of combat, but on the slow, patient, and often deeply boring procedures of deception. We will explore the technical specifications of their inflatable arsenal, the painstaking process of recording and calibrating their sonic deceptions, and the bureaucratic and logistical challenges of staging a phantom war. This is the story of how 1,100 artists spent 2 years fooling Hitler's entire army, a journey into the strange, forgotten, and brilliant history of the unit that would become known as the Ghost Army. The empty battlefield. A new kind of soldier is needed. To understand why an army of artists was created, you must first understand the immense and terrifying strategic problem that faced the Allied High Command in 1943 and 1944. They were planning the single largest and most complex amphibious invasion in human history, the D-Day landings, the Great Crusade, to liberate Europe. But the continent of Europe was not an open door. It was a fortress. The Germans, under the command of the brilliant Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent years constructing the Atlantic Wall, a formidable network of concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, machine gun nests, and millions of mines and obstacles, stretching for thousands of miles along the coastline. The Allies knew that a direct, head-on assault against a prepared and waiting German army would be a suicidal bloodbath. The entire success of the invasion, and the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers, depended on one single critical factor: surprise. The Allies could not hope to be strong everywhere. They had to concentrate their immense invasion force on a single, specific target: the beaches of Normandy. Their entire strategy, therefore, was built upon a grand deception. They had to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion was going to land somewhere else entirely, the most logical target, The place the Germans expected the attack to come was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, directly across from Dover. The Allies' task was to feed this German expectation, to create a phantom army so large, so powerful, and so convincing that Hitler would keep his best and most powerful panzer divisions stationed at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. This grand strategic deception was known as Operation Fortitude. It was a massive, multi-layered campaign of lies. It involved fake radio traffic, double agents spreading false information, and even the creation of a completely fictional army, the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG, supposedly under the command of the Allies' most feared general, George S. Patton. But an army in the age of aerial reconnaissance cannot exist only as radio waves. The Germans needed to see it. They needed to see evidence on the ground of a massive military build-up in southeastern England, directly opposite Calais. And after the real landings at Normandy, the Allies needed a way to keep the lie going, to convince the Germans that Normandy was merely a diversion and that Patton's main army was still waiting to strike at Calais. This required a new kind of military unit. Regular soldiers are trained to fight, to be seen, to be a powerful and visible presence. But the Allies needed a unit that was trained in the opposite art, the art of illusion. They needed a mobile, flexible, and highly creative force that could travel the battlefields of France, creating the impression of a massive military presence where there was only an empty field. They needed men who could not just follow orders, but could improvise, who could act like a tank column or a division headquarters. This was not a job for conventional soldiers. The empty battlefield of the deception required a new kind of army and a new kind of soldier to fill it. The Ghost recruitment program, from art schools to boot camp. And so, the call went out. But it was not a call for the usual kind of soldier. The recruitment poster for this new top-secret unit might as well have read, "Uncle Sam wants you, if you can draw, or act, or mix sound." The commanders tasked with creating this phantom army, men like Colonel Harry L. Reeder and Major Ralph Ingersoll, knew that to build a unit that could fool the German war machine, they needed to recruit not from the farms and factories of America, but from its creative heart. They needed a very specific kind of soldier, a man whose primary weapon was his imagination. The recruitment process was unlike any other in the US Army. Instead of seeking out men with athletic prowess or marksmanship skills, the unit's organizers scoured the art schools of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. They were looking for painters, illustrators, and designers, young men who had been training to create fine art, but whose skills in perspective, shadow, and color theory were about to be repurposed for the battlefield. They needed artists who could look at a rubber, inflatable, and, with a few carefully applied strokes of paint, make its fake shadows look real from a reconnaissance plane flying at 5,000 feet. They needed men who could convincingly forge the shoulder patches and vehicle markings of a dozen different infantry and armored divisions. Among the young art students recruited for this strange task was a man who would later become one of the 20th century's most celebrated abstract painters, Ellsworth Kelly. Next, they went to the radio networks and the great recording studios of the era. They recruited sound engineers, audio technicians, and radio operators. These were the men who understood the subtle art of acoustics and the science of sound waves. Their job would be to create a perfect, high-fidelity audio illusion of war. They would be sent to the front lines to make pristine recordings of the specific sounds of different American tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, which would later form the sonic arsenal of the Ghost Army. Finally, they recruited from the world of theater and advertising. They needed men with a flair for the dramatic, actors and stage designers who understood how to create a convincing performance. These men would be tasked with social deception, impersonating officers from other divisions, driving into French towns in a carefully staged convoy, and talking loudly in cafes about fictional battle plans, all for the benefit of any local German informants. One of the men recruited for this theatrical work was a young man named Bill Blass. who would go on to become a world-famous fashion designer. This strange collection of painters, actors, engineers, and creatives were then put through the jarring reality of traditional military boot camp, a culture clash of artistic individualism against rigid army discipline before beginning the specialized training for their unique and secret mission. The Ghost Army was being assembled, a carefully curated cast of characters for the greatest performance of the Second World War, mastering the craft, boring training in theatrical warfare. Having assembled their strange and brilliant cast of characters, the US Army was now faced with a unique challenge: how to train an artist to be a soldier, and how to train a soldier to be an artist of deception. After the initial jarring shock of standard boot camp, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were moved to specialist training grounds like Camp Forest in Tennessee. Here, their training diverged completely from that of any other unit. While a regular infantryman was learning how to zero his rifle, strip his machine gun, and master the art of the bayonet charge, these men were learning to master a far stranger and more subtle set of skills. They were being trained in the slow, methodical, and deeply boring art of theatrical warfare. Their curriculum was a world away from the adrenaline of combat. The visual deception units would spend endless, repetitive hours practicing the deployment of their inflatable decoys. This was not a simple matter of blowing up a rubber tank and leaving it in a field. It was a science. They studied aerial reconnaissance photographs to understand the precise, geometric patterns that a real tank column would form when parked. They learned the methodical process of creating fake tracks in the mud, using special rollers attached to the back of their trucks to mimic the signature tread marks of a 30-ton Sherman tank. They drilled obsessively in what they called dummy discipline, a painstaking attention to detail that meant ensuring the fake vehicles were camouflaged inconsistently, just as a real, tired unit would do, and even simulating the daily life of a real unit by hanging laundry near a fake barracks or creating fake latrines. The sonic deception teams underwent their own form of tedious technical training. They were not learning to fire weapons, but to orchestrate the sound of them. They spent their days in the back of their armored half-tracks, surrounded by massive wire recorders, turntables, and a complex switchboard of amplifiers and speakers. Their training was in the science of acoustics. They had to learn how to calculate the way sound travels over different terrains and in different weather conditions, adjusting the volume and direction of their broadcasts to create a perfectly convincing audio illusion. They would practice mixing the different pre-recorded audio tracks, the rumble of a tank column, the clatter of an engineering corps building a bridge, the shouts of officers, into a layered, believable symphony of a non-existent army on the move. The radio operators, meanwhile, engaged in their own form of meticulous mimicry. Their training was in impersonation. They had to learn how to perfectly copy the unique, rhythmic keying style, the fist of the radio operators, in the real divisions they were pretending to be. They studied the specific slang, the procedural chatter, and the communication patterns of these units until they could create a completely convincing, but entirely fictional, radio network that would fill the airwaves with the busy, mundane traffic of a massive force. This combination of visual, sonic, and radio deception was the art of theatrical warfare. It was a slow, repetitive, and deeply boring process of mastering the thousands of tiny details that, when combined, had the power to create a perfect, life-saving illusion. The inflatable arsenal, a technical breakdown of rubber tanks. At the very heart of the Ghost Army's great deception, the most tangible and surreal part of their entire operation was their inflatable arsenal. The primary weapon of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was not a cannon that fired shells, but a machine that created illusions. Their job was to populate the empty battlefields of France with the convincing ghosts of an entire armored division. And to do this, they were equipped with one of the strangest and most brilliant pieces of military hardware of the war, a collection of hundreds of life-sized, inflatable rubber replicas of tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and even airplanes. These were not simple balloons. They were sophisticated, meticulously designed decoys, manufactured by the great rubber companies of the United States. The material was a sophisticated, vulcanized rubber-impregnated canvas, a fabric that was both lightweight enough to be portable and durable enough to withstand the rigors of a military campaign. Each decoy consisted of a complex skeleton of interconnected, high-pressure, inflatable tubes that would give the object its basic shape and structural integrity. Over this pneumatic skeleton, a detailed, painted outer skin was stretched, perfectly mimicking the contours, the turret, the cannon, and even the hatches of a 30-ton Mi-4 Sherman tank or a P-51 Mustang fighter plane. The deployment of these rubber ghosts was a carefully drilled and methodical protocol. A single, deflated Sherman tank could be packed into a duffel bag about the size of a soldier's kit. A team of just 4 to 6 men could carry this 90-pound tank into a field, unroll it, and, using a powerful air compressor, inflate it into a full-sized, menacing-looking armored vehicle in about 20 minutes. They had to be careful with the air pressure requirements. Too little, and the tank would look saggy and unrealistic from the air. Too much, and it risked splitting a seam. This was the genius of the inflatable arsenal. Its profound asymmetry of effort. A handful of men, in a couple of hours, could create the illusion of an entire armored battalion arriving overnight. They could populate a fake airfield with a full squadron of fighter planes. The image of 4 soldiers physically picking up a 30-ton tank and moving it to a new position is the defining, surreal image of the Ghost Army at work. These were not just props. They were a revolutionary form of psychological warfare. Their combination of high-fidelity realism and incredible mobility allowed the 23rd to conduct their deceptions with a speed and flexibility that was impossible to counter, creating a state of constant confusion and misdirection for German aerial reconnaissance and military intelligence. The inflatable tank was the physical embodiment of the Ghost Army's mission to create a powerful, threatening, and utterly convincing illusion out of nothing more than air, rubber, and artistic ingenuity. Visual deception, the slow art of battlefield camouflage. To have an arsenal of inflatable tanks is one thing. To make them believable is another entirely. A brand new, perfectly inflated rubber decoy, sitting alone in a pristine green field, would not fool a German reconnaissance pilot for a single second. It would look exactly like what it was, a fake. The true secret art of the Ghost Army's visual deception lay not in the objects themselves, but in the slow, methodical, and deeply creative process of integrating those objects into the surrounding landscape. This was the work of the artists, the task of transforming a collection of props into a completely convincing, living, breathing illusion. Their work began with the fundamental artistic discipline of camouflage. The men recruited from the art schools of America brought with them a sophisticated understanding of color, theory, of light, and of shadow. When the unit arrived in a new area of operations in France or Germany, the artists would immediately begin studying the local environment. They would analyze the specific color palette of the soil, the precise shades of green of the local foliage, and the patterns of the natural landscape. They would then create custom paint mixing formulas, blending the standard issue olive drab and khaki paints to perfectly match the terrain, ensuring their inflatable tanks and real vehicles would seamlessly merge with their surroundings. They practiced different brush application methods, learning how a stippled pattern could break up a vehicle's outline more effectively than a solid coat. But their greatest skill was in creating a sense of history and life in a place that, just hours before, had been an empty field. This was theatrical set, dressing on a massive, military scale. The most important element was creating the evidence of heavy machinery. A real 30-ton tank leaves an unmistakable signature on the earth. To replicate this, the Ghost Army used specially designed rollers attached to the back of their trucks and half-tracks, which were embossed with the exact tread pattern of a Sherman tank. They would spend hours driving these vehicles back and forth in carefully planned patterns, churning up the mud and pressing the fake tracks into the ground to create the convincing illusion that a massive armored column had recently passed through or parked there. This was supplemented by sheer, hard, physical labor. The men would dig dozens of dummy foxholes, empty gun emplacements, and fake command posts. An army at rest is an army that digs in, and the Ghost Army had to perfectly replicate this behavior. Finally, they practiced what they called dummy discipline. This was the art of deliberate imperfection. A real, battle-weary unit is not perfectly neat and tidy, and so the artists of the 23rd would carefully scatter random, convincing debris around their fake encampments. Empty ration cans, discarded oil drums, ammunition crates, and even fake laundry lines. They learned to make their deceptions look not just real, but tired and a little bit sloppy. The final, brilliant touch of authenticity. The goal was not just to create fake objects, it was to create a fake and completely convincing recent history in the landscape. A story that would tell any German pilot flying overhead that a powerful American army was right where they were supposed to be. Staging the illusion, methodical deployment protocols and placement doctrine. A single, well-camouflaged rubber tank is a clever prop. A field full of them, supported by sound and radio traffic, is a weapon. But to wield that weapon effectively, the men of the Ghost Army could not be mere artists and improvisers. They had to be masters of a new and highly disciplined form of military science, the art of staging a mass deception. Their operations were not chaotic improvisations. They were meticulously scripted, carefully choreographed, and executed with a rigid, step-by-step protocol. Every mission, whether it was to simulate an armored division gathering for an attack or to create a phantom defensive line, followed a precise and methodical doctrine. The process would begin with reconnaissance. A small team of officers, often including an artist and an engineer, would scout a potential location for the show. They were looking for the perfect stage. This required a specific set of features: good road access for their own convoy of trucks, sufficient tree cover or woods to hide their real vehicles, and the air compressors needed to inflate the decoys, and, most importantly, a large, open area that was clearly visible to German aerial reconnaissance. They were, in essence, location scouting for a film, choosing the perfect set on which to perform their elaborate lie for an audience of enemy pilots and intelligence analysts. Once the stage was chosen, the performance would begin under the cover of darkness. A convoy of the 23rd trucks and half-tracks would roll into the area, and the men would set to work with a quiet and practiced efficiency. The deployment was a masterpiece of coordination. One team would be responsible for the physical decoys, unrolling the heavy rubber canvas of the tanks and artillery pieces, according to a pre-planned, irregular layout that would mimic the behavior of a real unit. As the air compressors hummed to life in the darkness, the phantom army would slowly rise from the earth. Simultaneously, another team would be creating the history of that army in the mud, driving their specialized jeeps and trucks to carve the convincing tracks of a 30,000-man division into the landscape. As the physical illusion was taking shape on the ground, the other elements of the deception would spring to life. In a hidden command truck, the radio deception unit would begin broadcasting, their operators perfectly mimicking the call signs and communication patterns of the specific, real division they were impersonating. They would simulate the mundane, procedural chatter of a unit arriving at a new position, creating a rich, invisible layer of evidence for German radio intercept operators. The sonic deception team would begin their own quiet work, positioning their massive speakers for the performance that would begin at dawn. By the time the sun rose, a complete, multi-sensory illusion had been created. An empty field had been transformed into the temporary home of a massive and threatening American army. The play had been staged, and now its actors just had to wait for their audience. The sonic deception, a symphony of destruction from armored speakers. A silent army is a dead army. The most convincing visual illusion in the world, a field filled with hundreds of perfectly rendered inflatable tanks, would be revealed as a fraud by the simple, profound absence of sound. An armored division is not just a collection of vehicles, it is a source of immense, earth-shaking, and unmistakable noise. The second, crucial layer of the Ghost Army's great deception was therefore designed to attack not the enemy's eyes, but their ears. This was the work of the 3,130-ton Signal Service Company, the Sonic Deception Unit, whose mission was to create a perfectly believable, high-fidelity symphony of a non-existent war. The process began not on the battlefields of France, but in the sound laboratories and recording studios of the United States. The unit's sound engineers, many recruited from top radio networks and companies like RCA, were given a unique task: to create a comprehensive sound effects library of the US Army at war. They were sent to the front lines with state-of-the-art wire recorders, the precursors to magnetic tape recorders, and they captured the authentic sounds of the Allied war machine with a fanatical attention to detail. They recorded the specific, clattering rumble of a column of Sherman tanks moving along a cobblestone street. They captured the distinct, whining engine of a Jeep, the low growl of a 2.5-ton truck, and the chaotic, metallic clang and shouted commands of an engineering corps assembling a pontoon bridge. Back at their mobile sound studio, a converted truck, these engineers would work like Hollywood sound designers. They would take these individual, elemental recordings and meticulously mix them onto new, master spools of wire. This was not a simple playback of a single sound. It was an act of complex audio choreography. They would layer the different sounds, the rumble of the tanks, the shouts of the men, the distant crump of artillery to create a completely believable, hours-long audio program that perfectly mimicked the soundscape of a specific military unit, whether it was an armored division preparing for an attack or an infantry regiment digging in for the night. This carefully crafted symphony of destruction was then broadcast across the battlefield using the unit's most powerful weapon, a set of massive, 500-pound speakers mounted on the back of M3 half-tracks. These powerful speaker systems, a closely guarded secret, could project the sounds with incredible fidelity over a distance of up to 15 miles. Under the cover of darkness, a handful of these sound trucks would position themselves near the front lines, point their speakers towards the German positions, and begin broadcasting their pre-recorded masterpiece. For a German soldier in a listening post miles away, the effect would be terrifyingly convincing. He would hear, with his own ears, the unmistakable sound of a massive American armored division. Thousands of men and hundreds of tanks moving into the woods just over the next hill, preparing for a dawn assault. It was a revolutionary form of psychological warfare, the first use of a mobile, tactical sound army on a modern battlefield. It was a weapon that fought with nothing but noise, engineering the soundscape, recording and calibrating the audio arsenal. The sonic deception of the Ghost Army was far more than simply playing a record of a tank on a loudspeaker. It was a highly technical and sophisticated art form, a process of engineering a complete, immersive, and utterly convincing audio reality. The men of the 3,130-ton Signal Service Company were not just soldiers. They were sound designers, audio engineers, and battlefield acousticians. Their work began with a fanatical dedication to authenticity. To create a believable illusion, they first had to capture the real sounds of the American war machine with the highest possible fidelity. This was a dangerous and painstaking task. Teams of sound engineers, armed with state-of-the-art 75-pound wire recorders, would travel to the actual front lines. Their mission was to record a complete library of sounds, a sonic palette from which they would later paint their masterpieces of deception. They would spend hours in the mud and the cold, carefully positioning their microphones to capture the clean, isolated sound of a Sherman tank's squealing treads, the low, guttural rumble of a GMC truck convoy, the sharp, metallic clang of engineers building a pontoon bridge, and the distinct, booming signature of a 155mm long tom artillery piece. These were not generic sounds. They were specific, sonic fingerprints, and getting them often meant putting themselves in harm's way. Once these elemental sounds were captured, the work of the audio engineers began in their mobile studio, a converted 2.5-ton truck packed with turntables, amplifiers, and mixing equipment. Here, they would work like the producers of a grand radio play. They would take the individual recordings and meticulously mix them onto new, master spools of wire, creating a full, layered, and believable soundscape. They would carefully blend the sounds of the tank column with the sounds of shouted commands, the distant rumble of artillery, and the ambient noise of a large group of men at rest. The final recording would be a complete, hours-long audio program that realistically mimicked the sonic life of an entire division. This process of calibration was essential. The volume, timing, and layering had to be perfect. The final step was the broadcast itself, a task that required its own form of scientific and technical mastery. The sonic officers had to be expert acousticians, calculating how sound would travel across the specific terrain of their operation. They had to account for wind direction, for the muffling effect of a dense forest, for the way sound might echo off a hillside. Their work was a strange and unprecedented fusion of art and science, the methodical, technical process of creating a perfect, life-saving lie, radio deception, weaving a web of false information. The visual and sonic deceptions of the Ghost Army were designed to fool the enemy's eyes and ears on the front line. But a third, equally crucial, element of their performance was designed to fool the enemy's intelligence analysts, the men sitting in listening posts miles behind the lines, trying to build a picture of the Allied order of battle. This was the world of radio deception, an invisible and highly technical art form that gave the phantom armies their voice. An army division of 30,000 men is not a silent entity. It is a massive, complex organism that is constantly communicating with itself and with its commanders through a complex web of radio traffic. The Ghost Army's radio deception unit was tasked with creating a perfect, high-fidelity replica of this invisible network. Their operators were specially chosen for their skill and their ability to mimic others. Their most important task was to perfectly copy the unique, rhythmic keying style, the fist, of the radio operators in the real divisions they were pretending to be. Just as every person has a unique signature, every radio operator has a unique way of tapping out Morse code, a specific rhythm and weight that is instantly recognizable to an experienced listener. The Ghost Army operators would study recordings of a real unit's traffic until they could impersonate their operators flawlessly. From their radio trucks, they would broadcast a carefully scripted, but entirely fictional, stream of communication. Most of this was deliberately mundane. They would simulate the boring procedural chatter that makes up the bulk of real military radio traffic units reporting their positions, requests for supplies, weather updates. This created a rich and believable backdrop of normalcy. But woven into this mundane chatter were the crucial pieces of disinformation. A fictional unit reporting that it was moving to a new position, a fake headquarters complaining about a non-existent traffic jam, or a phantom artillery spotter calling in coordinates for a fictional target. They even employed a clever technical trick known as spoofing. By carefully triangulating their signals between multiple radio trucks, they could make their broadcasts appear to be coming from a single, specific location, for example, the middle of an empty field, where they wanted the Germans to believe a massive divisional headquarters was located. The radio deception was the invisible thread that tied the entire illusion together. It gave the inflatable tanks and the sonic broadcasts a voice, a personality, and a place in the enemy's intelligence reports. It was a complex and masterfully executed web of lies, broadcast silently into the ether. Masters of disguise, theatrical procedures, and uniform authenticity. The final layer of the Ghost Army's great deception was the most intimate and, in some ways, the most dangerous. It was the human element, the art of theatrical performance. The inflatable tanks and the sonic broadcasts could create the impression of a large army from a distance. But to make the illusion truly convincing up close, the enemy needed to see what they believed were real American soldiers. This was the work of social deception, a series of carefully staged plays performed for a very specific audience, the local French civilians, who the Allies knew were being watched by a network of local German informants and collaborators. The men of the Ghost Army became masters of disguise. The artists in the unit, who had already mastered the art of camouflage, turned their skills to the creation of fake divisional insignia. They would spend hours meticulously hand-painting the shoulder patches and vehicle markings of the specific, real divisions they were impersonating. A convoy of a dozen trucks could be made to look like it belonged to the 6th Armored Division, simply by changing the stencils on their bumpers. Authenticity was an obsession. The men were drilled on the specific history, size, and even the commanding officer's name of the units they were pretending to be, so they could answer any questions convincingly. The performance itself was a piece of carefully choreographed street theater. A small group of soldiers would be chosen for the mission. They would put on the fake shoulder patches, apply the correct stenciled markings to their jeeps, and drive into the nearest town. Their mission was simple: to be seen. They would find a local cafe or tavern, order a drink, and begin talking loudly amongst themselves. Their conversations were scripted. They would complain about their fictional commanding officer. They would talk about their units, non-existent, upcoming orders, to move towards a specific part of the front, and they would grumble about the entirely fictional preparations for a major attack. Other times, the performance was even more elaborate. They would simulate a general's arrival at a command post, with a staff car, military police escorts, and an actor dressed in a general's uniform, striding into a local chateau that they had commandeered for the afternoon. The entire performance was a carefully crafted lie, designed to be witnessed by the right people, and reported back up the German intelligence chain as a credible, first-hand human intelligence report. It was a dangerous game. These men were often operating close to the front lines, with only their wits and their acting skills to protect them. It was the final, human touch that made the grand, technical illusion of the Ghost Army so utterly and so successfully believable. A secret kept for 50 years. The slow declassification process. When the war in Europe finally ended in May of 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops packed up their inflatable tanks, their wire recorders, and their theatrical props for the last time. They had conducted more than 20 successful battlefield deceptions. Their phantom armies had drawn enemy fire, held non-existent lines, and saved thousands of American lives. They returned home as veterans of one of the most unique, creative, and successful units of the entire war. And then, they were ordered to become ghosts themselves. Upon their discharge, the men were required to sign documents, swearing them to absolute secrecy. The very existence of the Ghost Army, its strange tactics, its bizarre arsenal, and the full extent of its operations were all classified as top secret by the US government. The reasoning was simple and logical. The techniques of multimedia, tactical deception they had pioneered were considered so effective that they were a valuable military asset, a weapon to be kept in reserve for future conflicts, particularly the looming Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so, the story of the 23rd was officially erased. This created a strange and often frustrating post-war existence for the veterans. They returned to their civilian lives, becoming famous artists, celebrated fashion designers, and successful architects. But they could never speak about their most significant contribution to the war effort. They could tell their families they had served in the army, but they could not explain what they had actually done. They attended veterans' reunions where men from other divisions would swap stories of battles and campaigns, but they had to remain silent, their own war stories locked away by a vow of secrecy. For 50 years, their incredible history was a blank page, a non-existent unit that had left no official trace. It was only in the 1980s, after a few veterans began to cautiously tell their stories, that a slow and painstaking process of declassification began. Finally, in 1996, a full half-century after the end of the war, the unit's official records were unsealed, and the incredible, surreal story of the Ghost Army was, at long last, allowed to be told. Operation Elephant. The Ghosts arrive in Normandy, just 2 weeks after the D-Day landings in June of 1944, as the Allies were fighting desperately to consolidate their foothold in the hedgerow country of Normandy. The Ghost Army was called upon to conduct one of its first and most important missions in France. The American forces were preparing for a major, decisive assault on the heavily fortified port of Brest, a crucial objective in their plan to break out from the Normandy beachhead. To give the real American units a better chance of success, the 23rd was tasked with a classic misdirection play, codenamed Operation Elephant. Their mission was to create the convincing illusion that a massive American force, specifically the 23rd Armored Division, was massing for an attack on a different part of the front line, miles away from the real target. The goal was to draw German attention and, most importantly, their powerful artillery, away from the true axis of the Allied assault. The men of the 23rd, fresh from their training, deployed their full arsenal of deception for the first time in a major combat operation. Under the cover of darkness, they moved their convoy of trucks and half-tracks into position. The visual deception teams went to work, inflating their rubber Sherman tanks and positioning them in carefully chosen fields, visible to any German reconnaissance planes. They created the convincing tracks of a recently arrived armored column and dug dummy gun emplacements. As dawn broke, the sonic deception unit began its performance. From their powerful speakers, hidden in the woods, they broadcast their high-fidelity recordings of rumbling tanks, of engineering units, and of the general, chaotic noise of a large armored division preparing for an attack. At the same time, the radio operators began broadcasting fake traffic, mimicking the call signs and communication patterns of the 23rd Armored Division, creating a rich, invisible layer of evidence for German radio intercept units. For 2 days, they maintained this multi-layered, completely fictional threat. The deception was a success. German artillery, which should have been aimed at the real American advance, was instead diverted to shell the empty fields and the rubber tanks of the Ghost Army, holding a phantom line. The art of the empty foxhole. The work of the Ghost Army was not always about grand, offensive misdirection. Sometimes, their mission was far more dangerous and nerve-wracking: to use their illusions to defend a real, dangerously thin section of the American front line. In September of 1944, after the brutal and costly fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, a major American infantry division was exhausted and needed to be pulled back to rest and refit. This left a significant 7-mile-long gap in the American line, a soft spot that, if discovered by the Germans, could be exploited for a devastating counterattack. The 23rd was rushed in to plug this gap. Their mission was to create the illusion that the line was still being held by a full-strength division. This was perhaps their most dangerous work. They were no longer operating miles away from the enemy. They were the front line. A handful of men and their strange props were all that stood between the German army and a breakthrough. The visual deception was minimal, as being too close to the enemy meant their inflatable tanks could be easily identified as fakes. So, they relied on their most subtle and effective tools. The sonic deception unit became the star of the show. They would drive their sound trucks up and down the 7-mile line throughout the night, broadcasting the sounds of a division on the move, but never staying in one place for too long. They would play the sounds of a jeep patrol driving down a road, then go silent. An hour later, from a different location, they would broadcast the sound of an engineering crew repairing a bridge, or the distant rumble of tanks moving into a new defensive position. The goal was to create the auditory illusion of a busy, active, and well-manned front line. During the day, they would supplement this with small-scale visual tricks. They would drive a single, real tank up and down different roads, ensuring it was seen by German spotters. They would send out jeeps with the wrong divisional markings to create confusion. For over a week, this small unit of artists and engineers used their strange, ethereal arsenal to hold a real gap in the line, convincing the Germans that they were facing a formidable force when, in reality, they were facing little more than a handful of men, a few armored speakers, and an incredible amount of courage. The Rhine crossing, a masterpiece of multimedia deception. In March of 1945, the Allied armies stood at the edge of the last great natural barrier to the heart of Germany, the Rhine River. A successful crossing would signal the final, decisive phase of the war in Europe. The American Ninth Army was tasked with a massive assault across the river, codenamed Operation Plunder. But to do so, they would need a powerful diversion. a grand performance to draw the eyes and the guns of the German defenders to the wrong place. For this, their final and most ambitious production, the Allies once again called upon the Ghost Army. Their mission, codenamed Operation Virsen, was the largest and most complex deception the unit would ever attempt. They were ordered to stage a completely fictional crossing of the Rhine, 10 miles south of the real assault point, and they were not just impersonating a single division. They were tasked with simulating 2 full armored divisions, the 30th and the 79th, a phantom force of over 30,000 men and hundreds of tanks. The goal was to convince the Germans that a massive pincer movement was developing, forcing them to commit their precious artillery and reserve forces to shelling a ghost. For 2 full weeks leading up to the real crossing, the Ghost Army deployed every single trick in their arsenal in a seamless, multi-layered masterpiece of deception. The visual unit deployed over 600 inflatable tanks, cannons, and trucks, carefully arranged in convincing marshalling areas. They drove their real vehicles in looping convoys at night, with only one headlight on, to create the impression of a vast, endless column of reinforcements arriving in the dark. The radio operators of the 23rd mimicked the traffic of 2 full divisions, filling the airwaves with the complex and busy chatter of an army preparing for a river assault. But the star of this show was the sonic deception unit. For the first time, they broadcast not just the sounds of an army assembling, but the sounds of an army actively beginning a river crossing. For days and nights on end, from their powerful speakers hidden along the riverbank, they broadcast the high-fidelity recordings of an engineering corps at work, the sounds of heavy trucks arriving with equipment, the clang of steel pontoon bridges being assembled, and the whine of outboard motors on reconnaissance boats. They created a complete auditory illusion that a massive bridging operation was underway. The deception was a spectacular success. The German command was completely fooled. Believing the main assault was coming at the Ghost Army's position, they unleashed a furious artillery barrage, raining down shells for days on the empty fields and the deflating rubber tanks, allowing the real Ninth Army to cross the Rhine further north against significantly lighter opposition, saving countless lives. The human cost, close calls, and the dangers of being a ghost. The story of the Ghost Army, with its inflatable tanks and theatrical tricks, can often sound like a strange, almost whimsical game of make-believe. But it is crucial to remember that this was not a game. While their mission was to create illusions, the danger they faced was very real. They were not just artists. They were soldiers, operating in a live combat zone, often placing themselves in positions of extreme vulnerability, armed with little more than their own creativity and courage. Their war was a constant, high-stakes gamble, a performance on a fragile stage where a single mistake could bring the entire production, and the men themselves, to a bloody and catastrophic end. The greatest danger was their proximity to the enemy. To be effective, their deceptions, particularly the sonic illusions, had to be believable. This meant they often had to operate within just a few miles of the German front lines, and sometimes even in front of the American lines, in the dangerous territory of no man's land. This put them well within the range of German patrols and, most terrifyingly, their artillery. One of the strange paradoxes of their work was that a German artillery shell landing in the middle of their inflatable tank division was actually a good thing. It was proof the enemy was falling for the deception. But for the small handful of real men hiding in the woods nearby, operating the speakers and compressors, those shells were lethally real. The unit was also incredibly lightly armed. A full-strength American armored division had thousands of riflemen, machine gunners, and its own powerful artillery and tank destroyers to protect it. The Ghost Army, which was impersonating such a division, had only its small collection of jeeps and half-tracks, a few 50 caliber machine guns, and the personal rifles of its men. They had no real tanks, no anti-tank guns, and no artillery. If the Germans had ever decided to call their bluff, to launch a probing attack or a full-scale assault on their position, the Ghost Army would have been annihilated. Their only defense was the quality of their performance. The psychological pressure of this reality of knowing that your survival depended entirely on the believability of your illusion was immense. In the end, the unit suffered 3 men killed in action and dozens wounded. It is a low number compared to a frontline infantry unit, but it is a vital and sobering reminder that the art of waging a phantom war was a dangerous and costly human endeavor. The war ends. The final, silent disappearance of the 23rd, when the war in Europe finally ground to a halt in May of 1945, a wave of celebration and relief swept across the Allied armies. For millions of soldiers, the long, brutal fight was over. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, there was one final, top-secret mission to conduct. Their job had been to create illusions, to make phantom armies appear and disappear at will. Now, their final order was to make themselves disappear. The men packed up their strange and unique arsenal for the last time. The inflatable tanks were deflated, folded, and crated. The spools of wire containing their symphonies of destruction were carefully boxed. The theatrical props, the fake shoulder patches and vehicle stencils, were all put into storage. The men returned to the United States and, like millions of other GIs, were honorably discharged and sent home to their families. But they were sent home with a secret, a burden of silence that they were ordered to carry for the rest of their lives. During their final debriefings, the men were required to sign documents, swearing them to absolute secrecy about the true nature of their unit and its missions. Their entire history, their incredible and unprecedented contribution to the war effort, was officially classified as top secret by the US government. Their service records were often sanitized, their time in the 23rd listed under a vague and innocuous title. The reason was simple. The tactics of multimedia, tactical deception they had pioneered, were deemed so revolutionary and so effective that they were a valuable military asset, a weapon to be kept secret for potential use in future conflicts, particularly the dawning Cold War. And so, the Ghost Army was not just disbanded, it was officially erased from the history books. The men returned to their civilian lives, becoming famous artists like Ellsworth Kelly, celebrated fashion designers like Bill Blass, and renowned photographers like Art Kane, but they could never speak of their most significant work. For 50 years, their incredible story was a blank page, a non-existent unit that had left no official trace. It was the unit's final and most successful deception. Their last mission was to make themselves disappear from history, and they did so perfectly. Their secret kept safe until it was finally declassified in 1996, allowing the world to, at long last, learn the story of the army of artists that had fought a war of ghosts. Measuring a shadow, analyzing the true impact of the Ghost Army. How do you measure the impact of an army that never fired a shot in anger? How do you quantify the effectiveness of an illusion? This was the challenge that faced military historians after the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was finally declassified. The Ghost Army left behind no battlefield victories in the traditional sense, no captured territory, no enemy casualty reports. Their legacy was written in the battles that were never fought, in the artillery shells that landed on empty fields, and in the German panzer divisions that waited patiently for an attack that never came. Their impact can only be measured as a shadow, a profound and significant absence of violence. The process of analyzing their effectiveness was a slow and painstaking one, requiring historians to cross-reference the Ghost Army's secret operational records with captured German intelligence reports and battle logs. What they found was remarkable. In report after report, they could see clear evidence of the German High Command reacting directly to the Ghost Army's deceptions. They could see a German general moving his reserve forces to counter a phantom river crossing. They could read the intelligence assessments that confidently identified 2 American armored divisions massing in a sector that, in reality, was being held by a handful of sound trucks and a few hundred men. While it is impossible to know the exact number with certainty, an official US Army analysis conducted after the war, attempted to quantify the unit's impact. Their sober and conservative conclusion was that the actions of the 23rd had saved the lives of between 10,000 and 30,000 American soldiers. By drawing enemy fire, by tying up enemy resources, and by clearing the way for real American advances, this small unit of 1,100 artists and engineers had had a strategic impact on the battlefield that was wildly disproportionate to its size. Their contribution was invisible, but it was not insignificant. Judged by the simple metric of lives saved versus casualties incurred, the Ghost Army may have been one of the most efficient and successful units of the entire Second World War. The artists of war, the post-war lives of the unit's famous members. The men of the Ghost Army were recruited because they were artists, and when their secret war was over, it was to the world of art and design that they returned. Their story does not end on the battlefields of Europe. It continues in the art galleries, the fashion houses, and the photography studios of post-war America. They had spent 2 years using their immense creative talents in the service of deception and destruction. They would spend the rest of their lives using those same talents in the service of creation and beauty, many of them becoming celebrated figures in their respective fields, their secret wartime history hidden from public view. Ellsworth Kelly, the young art student who had mastered the art of camouflage and the design of propaganda posters, returned to become one of the most important abstract painters and sculptors of the 20th century. His work, known for its pure, hard-edged blocks of color and its minimalist forms, would hang in the great museums of the world, including the Museum of Modern Art and the Guggenheim. Bill Blass, the young man who had practiced the art of theatrical deception, returned to New York and founded his own fashion house, becoming a globally recognized icon of American style and elegance. Art Kane, another member, would become one of the most influential photographers of his generation, famous for his iconic 1,958 portrait of 57 jazz legends, titled A Great Day in Harlem. The list goes on, a testament to the incredible concentration of creative talent that was assembled in this one strange unit. Their post-war success is a poignant and powerful final chapter to their story. It is a reminder that these men were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were creators who were asked, for a brief and violent period of their lives, to turn their skills to the art of war. They used their understanding of color, of form, of sound, and of performance to fool the enemy and save lives. And when their work was done, they quietly packed away those skills and returned to a world where they could use them once again to create things of lasting beauty. The most powerful weapon was an idea. And so, our journey into the strange, spectral world of the Ghost Army comes to a close. We have seen how a new kind of army was born from a desperate strategic need, how it was recruited from the art schools and sound studios of America, and how it was trained in the methodical and boring art of theatrical warfare. We have explored its strange and brilliant arsenal of inflatable tanks, of sonic deceptions, of false radio chatter, and of costumed performance. We have followed this phantom unit across the battlefields of Europe, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine, watching as they wielded their illusions to save the lives of their fellow soldiers. The story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops is a profound testament to the power of human creativity in the face of industrial-scale violence. It is a reminder that the most effective weapon in a war is not always the one that makes the loudest noise or creates the biggest explosion. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the Ghost Army's arsenal was not a rubber tank, a wire recording, or an armored speaker. It was a well-crafted, believable idea. It was the idea of an army that did not exist. They proved that a battle could be won, that a line could be held, and that lives could be saved, not by overwhelming the enemy's body, but by capturing their imagination. Their story was a secret for 50 years, a final, successful act of making themselves disappear. But now that it has been told, it leaves us with a final, enduring thought, that sometimes In a world defined by brute force, the greatest strength can be found in the quiet, patient, and methodical art of a perfect, life-saving illusion.